Implying depth is one of the easy ways to increase visual drama in a comic panel, or a painting, or a storyboard, or whatever. Now, when I say depth, don't just think linear perspective, because relying on linear perspective to create space is just silly, because it's both easier and more effective to use simpler tools like size, overlapping, and contrast. Size, overlapping, contrast. Linear perspective is also only available in urban settings or around rectilinear objects. When we want to draw scenes in the open ocean, for instance, we have no references to create vanishing points. And if we wanted to populate that scene with cartilaginous carnivores, their curvaceous bodies create these confusing linear perspectives. But that doesn't mean that we still don't need to have visual drama. Okay, first, what do I mean by visual drama? A picture can be exciting just based on content, like how if I were to draw a shipwrecked sloth here, now there is dramatic tension between these characters. I.e., we fear for the safety of the representation of a sloth, because we assume that this representation of a shark is filled with teeth that are controlled by a desire to rend and to tear. We infer all of this, although the picture itself is admittedly rather banal, which is pretty cool from a psychological standpoint, but it is not the only way to create drama. I can also make a picture more or less dramatic by manipulating strictly formal or abstract elements. So take this picture of Thomas and James, who are, as you can see, nothing more than rectangles, without any anthropomorphizable emotions or personalities. And without employing any fancy linear perspectives, as these are flat characters, I can imply that Thomas is close and James is far away just by changing their size. See how this arrangement has inherently more dramatic tension even before we introduce content. And see how this drawing is becoming increasingly more exciting now that I have implied a deep field of view. And depth is just one formal tool that influences visual drama, of course. I'm also a big fan of cropping, contrast, sequential rhythm, which are all topics that I'll be addressing in future videos, hopefully. Not to mention the wide world of motion and soundtracks if you're working in games or film. Now, being able to draw with low visual drama is just as important as being able to amp it up. For instance, comic panels meant to communicate calmness should obviously have lower visual drama. Also, in my situation with long-form comics, where I have an overall story arc to worry about, the majority of the story needs to have reduced visual drama or else the climaxes don't feel dramatic. But is it possible to intentionally decrease visual drama in spite of dramatic content? Well, take this awesome picture of tyrannosaurs and F-14s. Just by removing the implication of depth, now I'm going to draw a similar panel of tyrannosaurs and F-14s that is totally bereft of awesome, without even removing that supposedly dramatic diagonal composition that you learned about in art history if you didn't sleep through the Baroque lecture. Okay, but when creating depth, size doesn't always win out, however. We can actually undercut our sizist assumptions using this clever new technology called overlapping. For those unfamiliar with Christopher and Claire, we can eschew obfuscation by moving Christopher in front, and now we are clear where Claire is. And applying that concept to a real-life situation, like sloths in the water, we can see that this shark that we thought was in the foreground is in fact a mega shark. But what if we don't have the option of overlapping? What if we think that overlapping is guileless and unsophisticated? Nothing says class like atmosphere. To invoke science when light passes through air, or water, or whatever, it gets fucked with, and if it is traveling a long way, it's going to get fucked with a lot. Distance will take away detail, as well as decrease the intensity of highlights and of shadows, so objects appear to have less contrast. Said another way, objects with less contrast appear to be further away. And if you're working in color, you can take atmospheric perspective one step further even. Distance also removes low-frequency light, so red light. Some artists say this makes distant things more blue, but I personally think that's misleading and like to think of it as distant things being less red, because the way atmosphere removes contrast also makes bright blue objects less and less blue when they move away, because they're also losing some of that too. All this may sound like minutia, but our eyes are so trained to recognize this tiny little difference that we actually respond very readily to it. Hans Hofmann really liked to prove this point with his theory of visual push-pull on a flat canvas. And because I'm getting really bored of drawing sharks now, I'm going to repaint this scene totally abstractly to show how the implication of depth is maintained just using the atmospheric perspective concepts of color warmth and intensity. At this point, I'd like to make a shout out to David Malky for teaching me how to draw sharks, because I actually didn't know how to draw sharks before, and to JD Saxon for correcting my shark anatomy, because apparently Malky gave me incomplete information. And I should probably also thank Danielle Corsetto for not hating me for continuing to terrorize sloths with sharks. Thank you for watching. This has been Daxplains, a how-to series where I, Dax, attempt to illustrate an illustration topic, whether I know shit about it or not, in a time shorter than my attention span. And if this free video was useful to you, I still need Patreon patrons for my Eisner-nominated graphic novel, Failing Sky.